with the Ukrainian aid. The reality is there was some important aid in the Omni, but we should talk about how much it was. We spent $13 billion on Ukrainian aid out of a total appropriations package of $1.5 trillion. So for those of you doing math at home, that's less than 1% of what we passed in the middle of the night last week that was actually Ukrainian aid. Here's a depiction. This is the aid bill, and this tiny little sub-piece of 1% is the portion that was Ukrainian aid. So the reality is that the bill we voted on last week wasn't really about Ukrainian aid. Ukrainian aid was a little bit of sugar on the larger medicine of a $1.5 trillion bill that nobody would actually want to go home and to defend to the voters and to the taxpayers of America was well thought out. So why does this happen? Well, the American people aren't stupid. A lot of politicians think voters are stupid. They think you can jingle a shiny thing over here and then make up any claim you want. But the reality is voters aren't stupid. Voters are distracted and they're busy, but they're not unaware of what's happening here. They know why politicians talk like this, why they say that if you didn't vote for a $1.5 trillion bill, you were against puppies and you were against food for children. You were against all these really great mom and apple pie kind of things, when the reality is you probably voted against the bill because there was a whole bunch of schlock in it that was unvetted, not because you said, hey, I don't want the Ukrainian freedom fighters to have the military aid that they need. People talk like this so that they can bully the other side. This is, quite frankly, a boring speech. It is not a speech that I want to be giving, but the truth is, if you allow liars to constantly lie and they can get away with it, then they just keep doing it. So it's probably useful for us more often to take people's nonsense tweets, which they do for a bizarre audience of political weirdos on Twitter, and they should have to defend these statements in public. It is transparently obvious that if you vote against a $1.5 trillion bill, that doesn't mean you were voting against you were trying to vote against everything particularly in it, that you were against those kinds of funding. It might be because you were against lots of things in it that are indefensible for the voters. It's transparently stupid, and the voters get it. So to the question of do omnis make sense, the answer is no, we should do better. But the question that our republic is partly going to have to resolve if we're going to get healthy again as a polity is, will politicians be able to resist the short-term crack of social media? It doesn't look like very many of us in this body are interested in trying to speak to 70 and 75 and 80% of the electorate, but rather that lots and lots of politicians are completely happy to speak to the very narrow range of fan service that they do on Twitter. Many politicians are addicted to Twitter. They want their sick burns and their retweets and their likes. It's crack, and they have an addiction, and it's sad. The truth is that the folks who do this kind of garbage are hopelessly out of touch with the reality of the people's lives that we're actually supposed to be serving. It's not useful to drink your own bathwater, and Twitter isn't real life, so it's probably useful for us to pause more often and try to make sure we have some common facts about the connection between political Twitter and reality. So first, only 20% of Americans are on Twitter. 19 or 20% of Americans are on Twitter. Political Twitter is something like the 9th most watched portion of Twitter. Sports Twitter, a foretaste of heaven, unlike political Twitter, a foretaste of hell. Sports Twitter is much bigger than political Twitter. Hollywood Twitter is bigger than political Twitter. K-pop Twitter is much, much bigger than political Twitter. So let's just start by recognizing that only 20% of Americans are on Twitter, and politics isn't a top 5 sub-portion of Twitter. Of those that are on Twitter, only about 40% say they ever use Twitter for politics. But for the small minority of Americans who do pay attention to political Twitter, again, 40% of 20%, if you're doing math at home, we're now in single digits here. 40% of 20% is 8% of Americans. For those who do pay attention to political Twitter, the political tweets are dominated by a very, 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 very small share of American adults. Something like 80% of all tweets come from 10% of Twitter users. But this is the audience that politicians are playing for when they grandstand on Twitter. And let's be clear, this happens all over the political continuum. This isn't chiefly on the right or chiefly on the left. If you ever wonder why are politicians such weirdos, it's mostly because they're grandstanding for a very, very narrow niche audience of weirdos on Twitter. And so we should actually ask if it's healthy to continue doing that. So, to our core questions, the Ukrainians, do they need aid? Yes, they do. We should fund freedom fighters. To the question of do omnis work? No, they don't, and everybody knows it. But to the question of should we continue doing political discourse like this? Should we say that someone who had concerns about this was trying to kill off babies and puppies? No, we shouldn't lie like this. We shouldn't do that. We owe the voters better than that. We should tell the truth, and we should try to talk to voters like you're actually talking to a room of regular people who have jobs and who are actually trying to put bread on the table for their kids and probably are pretty grateful for the inheritance that is the American Republic and our leadership on the global stage for freedom lovers. The Ukrainians are that. We should fund the Ukrainians. We should have funded them in a more prudent way than an Omni. But if you voted for an Omni when I voted against it, I'm not going to attack you for voting for the Omni, but don't go out there and lie and pretend that somebody who voted against the Omni was against all the stuff in it, some of which is pretty decent. We can do better. We should. Thank you, Madam President.